I have the great pleasure and great honor to welcome you today on this very sunny, beautiful morning at our conference on new multilateralism and global economy. It's a third edition already of the conference looking at the cooperation between the European Union and Japan on global multilateral issues. And I'm very delighted that we have once again managed to gather a great crowd of excellent experts from various places in Europe, but not only Europe, and even particularly importantly from also our guests from Japan. I would like to greet them particularly warmly because they have made an effort to make this very long trip. Thank you very much for coming. And I've just said that this is already the third edition of this format, but I dare to say that the relevance of the discussion has not diminished since we organized the first conference 2 years ago. Just an opposite, I think the relevance of the debate about the future of multilateralism is today higher even than it was perhaps even the last year, because concerns about the states and future of the multilateral rules-based order are fueled by a number of developments in the world. And to be sure, the news of yesterday was that one of the key concerns we have today, a major trade conflict between China and the US, might have been perhaps postponed. New tariffs will not be introduced, as it seems, on 1st March by the US, but clearly this conflict, if I may put it so, is certainly not over. We know that there is a change in the US approach to China. China is portrayed today as a strategic competitor by the American administration. China itself has clearly increasing ambitions at the global arena. Even in Europe, concerns are rising. A recent report by the German Association of Business called China a partner and systemic competitor. But it's of course not just about the US-Chinese competition or conflict, if you will, but it's also about changing mood in various societies and states across the world. We see the rise of populism in countries like Brazil, in Italy, not to talk about others. And it is of course not helpful for pursuing international relations based upon mutual confidence, trust, and multilateral institutions. And another sign of a concerning state of global cooperation, I think, is the difficulty to conclude joint communiques of various multilateral fora. Most recently, we saw it with the G7 meeting in Canada, with Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting. So clearly, the bottom line of all that is that we have definitely a different situation than not only last year, but certainly, for example, 10 years ago, when multilateral cooperation arguably saved the world from a global depression after the financial crisis. So there is definitely a reason to think if and how the international cooperation could be fixed, and there is a number of reasons to do it in the EU-Japanese format. and not at least because Japan is chairing this year the G20 cooperation and has thus a special role in finding ways to build bridges between partners and forge compromises. And it was the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe who said earlier this year that it is within this multilateral global context that China should be also dealt with. He said that it will be easier for China to make concessions in support of a global agreement than in response to the US bilateral pressures. So clearly Japan is also for Europe an important partner in finding compromises and trying to fix the multilateral institutions. But there is, of course, lastly, yet another very important reason to have a closer look at Japan and the EU as possible allies in restoring multilateralism or fixing it. And this is the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, which has just entered into force on February the 1st. And we will discuss the implications of the agreement in more detail in a minute, in the first session of our conference. But I think it is not just the economic gains of this agreement which render this deal so relevant. It's of course the fact that it covers 1/3 of the world gross domestic product. This is very impressive, and the 1 billion euros saved in duties as estimated per year by EU exporters is also very meaningful. But what I think is particularly interesting for us at ECFR as a foreign policy think tank, but also for Europe as an actor at the international scene, are those wider political implications of this agreement. Hosukli Makiyama, an excellent expert in trade issues, said that this agreement is one of the few trade agreements of geopolitical importance, and he said that Japan is the only global actor capable of helping EU advance its agenda of open trade, rule of law, and social and environmental standards. And Cecilia Malmström, the EU Trade Commissioner, also underlined that this deal goes far beyond economics and will kickstart so many other processes of cooperation. And indeed, our conference is meant to explore these other processes of cooperation between Japan and the European Union, going beyond purely economic issues and trade. We will discuss in the second session the possible options for cooperation in Africa on the security, development aid. In the third session, we will talk about the challenges related to the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, in both economic and security sphere. So we will try to cover quite a broad range of issues of high relevance for both the European Union and Japan in the upcoming years. And with that, I would like to conclude my introductory remarks and wish you a very fruitful discussion, and pass the floor to Martin Ehl, who will chair the first session on the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement and its wider implications. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Piotr. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Martin Ehl from Czech Economic Daily. As probably the only journalist in the room, I have to impose on myself Chatham House rules. Just for anybody who would like to write anything about it. Without further ado, I would pass the floor to Sebastian, but before, I have to announce the small change in the program because Mr. Lukáš Poražinský couldn't attend the meeting, so we have a modern, better replacement. Instead of him, Mr. Krzysztof Trepczyński, ambassador and a long-term expert on international trade, will take part in our panel. But first, introductory remarks from Sebastian Dullien from ECFR.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here again. I was here last year, I think, on the last workshop, and I'm very happy to see that this agreement has been finalized, is in force now. So this is a big step forward. And so I'm glad to be here again. I would like to give you a short idea from a European perspective and what I think the EU-Japan agreement means for European trade policies. And in order to do that, I think we first need to understand the economics of this agreement. And as Piotr already hinted, I think the agreement is, even though it's a trade agreement, it's not a political agreement, is much more important politically than it's economically. And let me explain that to you first. I mean, it sounds really impressive. You started saying, well, this is, it depends a little bit how you count it, but it's about 30% of global GDP. It's a trade of 150 billion euros. That sounds pretty big, and it is the largest free trade agreement we have in the world so far. But if you go into the economics, it's much more limited. The EU-Japan trade is not that important, both for the EU and Japan, if you look at it from a perspective of total trade. And I mean, this is, that's logical. It doesn't have anything to do with bad will or, that the two countries or the two regions don't want to trade, but it's just distance. We know from empirics that distance is extremely important for trade, and that is very much reflected in the trade figures. Japan is the 7th most important trading partner of the EU, but because the first partners are so important, that doesn't mean that much. Actually, it's a little more than 3% of EU exports and around 4% of EU imports, so that's not that great or not that big. Just as a comparison, that's about the importance of Norway. Yeah, so the trade with Japan, EU-Japan, is about the trade EU-Norway. That's not nothing, but it's not comparable to the United States, and therefore economically, even if we increase trade with Japan dramatically, it would never be able to compensate for a serious trade war with the United States. We are going to hear more about that later, I guess, because there's this paper by Bruegel, which summarizes a number of simulation studies, and if you go into that, you see in the results that the economic importance of that agreement is limited. There's a few outliners, but if you take them out, the effect of the EU-Japan trade agreement is supposed to be about 0.1% of GDP. That is not a growth effect, that's a level effect. That means, according to these simulations, 10 years from now, GDP will be 0.1% higher than without the agreement. Just to break that down, GDP per capita in the EU is now around 30,000 euros per year. So that will increase GDP by 30 euros, GDP per capita, 30 euros a year, 10 years from now. That's not much. That's a coffee a week. Yeah, maybe, not even. And actually, for some countries, the impact is even less. If you look at Germany, there's a simulation from the Bertelsmann Foundation, and there you come to something which is even smaller. That's €4.30 over the period of 10 years in per capita incomes. So again, this is not that relevant. And if we take into account that these simulations in the past have rather overstated than understated the trade effect, you see where we are. However, of course, there will be some distributional effects. Some people might be harder hit or harder affected. For example, some Japanese farmers might feel more of that, and on the other hand, European car workers might be more affected. But, well, we know from the simulation that it is a fair deal, that both sides will get some benefits, but some groups are affected differently. But nevertheless, I think for a number of reasons, politically, it's an important agreement. And first, for the EU, it's great to see that we can still successfully conduct and finalize relatively large and comprehensive free trade agreements. Just as a reminder, the last times we tried that, they were a bit bumpy. CETA was almost derailed over the debate with over ISDS. So the agreement with Canada, I think it was a pretty close call that we actually ratified it. And those who have been in Europe and have followed that, we had the discussions we had this agreement completely negotiated. Then there were protests. The European Parliament voted against or signaled that it would not agree to that agreement, and the European Commission had to go back to Canada and reopen the agreement. Then they came up with the new rules for investor-state dispute settlement, and finally it was ratified, but only after Wallonia, province of Belgium, finally agreed to it. And up to that point, it wasn't ratified because it ended up to be a mixed agreement, so that all the member states had to agree to it, and some of the federal member states even subnational regions. So at that point, it became very questionable whether the EU would ever be able to finalize such a deal. And in this context, it's good to see that the EU-Japan agreement has come through. And by the way, there was also TTIP, officially the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Officially, Donald Trump took that off the table, but I think a lot of European governments were quite happy about that, because popular discontent has grown so large about TTIP that I think it would not have been able to ratify it. We had the largest demonstrations in Germany of the last decades against TTIP in Berlin, with more than 100,000 people in the streets. And compared to that, the EU-Japan trade agreement went very smoothly, and it shows that there still is power to negotiate trade agreements. Secondly, this trade agreement has been agreed in a relatively short period of time. Now you might say relatively short sounds a bit strange after this has been 7 years in the making or so, but again, if you compare that to other trade agreements, it's been quick. CETA took 10 years. Even the agreement with Singapore, which is a much smaller country and should be much easier, took 8 years. Second thing is, the agreement is still quite ambitious. It's not scaled back that much. We have a lot of WTO-X and WTO plus issues in it, which have been agreed upon, and it's a relatively comprehensive agreement. What can we learn for the management of such negotiations from a European side? I think what was very clever, and I know the Japanese are not entirely happy always about that, is that the EU Commission took the investor protection out of it. That now there's a separate agreement negotiated about investor protection, because it was the investor-state dispute settlement which derailed the CETA agreement, and the EU Commission at that point did react very slowly to the civil protests and civil unrest. But after the European Parliament has signaled that it would not step back beyond what they had agreed in CETA, and so they took it out, and so this agreement was much easier to be ratified. So that means, and I think this is a very important lesson to trade politicians, not just in Europe, but across the world, trade agreements often can have distributional effects. So that means they are not merely technocratic, but they are political. And if there is resistance from civil society, the answer cannot be that we push it through, but the answer has to be that we engage civil society and those who are skeptical and try to find a compromise. And if you do that, the people in Europe, they are not anti-free trade, but they might have concerns about certain issues, and it's much better to get something through which rests on a broad basis of support than to try to push through contentious issues. Again, what from a European perspective has been important here, that this is probably not a mixed agreement now. There might be a debate about that, but the EU-Japan agreement is probably an agreement which can just be ratified on the European level and doesn't have to go to the subnational level. So on a global scale, if you move away from this here, on a global scale, however, it doesn't necessarily mean that the EU can negotiate an agreement with the United States. Because I said before, the effects of this agreement are relatively small because of the distance. If we were to agree something with the United States, the effect would be much larger. And also because US corporations have a much worse image in Europe than Japanese corporations, I think there would be much more suspicion by civil society that a trade agreement with the United States would go against the interest of ordinary people. Now coming to the global perspective, because I was also asked to global trade system perspective here, I think it's great that Japan and the EU have signaled at this time that they are in favor of free markets, and Piotr already mentioned that this might help to push China to agree to reforms in WTO. We know that there are a lot of problems with the current WTO system, and some of the problems are that well, it's always that some countries, but it's basically China we're talking about, that China has used some of the provisions of WTO, which were basically designed for capitalist countries trading with each other, and have used that in a country in which the state has large influence on the markets to push forward well, developmental policies at the expense of the trading partners. And, well, for example, there's no provision in WTO which prevents you from currency manipulation and from mercantilist policies through that. There's a bit of a problem if you have state support to increase your market power in certain markets, or if you force other countries to transfer technology. There are some provisions to counter these things, but they are deemed to be not sufficient. So at this point, and the European Union has made some good proposals for the reform of WTO. And since the US has pushed pressure on China, if Japan and the EU can come up with a common position on this, that might be helpful for reform of WTO. But, and I think this is a big but, the question is how much that helps if we have a US administration in the White House as we have today. Because, frankly, we cannot be sure that the US really wants WTO reform, or whether the US wants to destroy WTO. There are some people in the administration and some of the advisors of Donald Trump who clearly, well, they're not in favor of WTO. And again, from economic theory, there might be a case to say, well, if we are the largest trading partner in the world, a power-based trading system might be more beneficial for us than a rule-based trading system. And at least some people, I wouldn't sign up for that, but some people in the US around Trump, they seem to believe that. Especially, and here it comes to China, we cannot be sure whether the intention of the White House really is to get some concessions from China, or whether the intention is to prevent China to technologically catch up to the United States for geopolitical reasons. If it's the later, then there's very little room for constructive compromise. Because China wants to catch up, and in a way you can say they have a right to, and if the US doesn't want that and wants to prevent that even at a high economic price, then there's no way to come here to a compromise. If this were the case, of course, the EU and Japan can still try to keep the WTO running, but the US as a WTO member, as long as they don't leave, and I think they won't, because it doesn't make any sense. Inside WTO, they can block a lot of things. And I think it's very difficult for the rest to operate WTO without, I mean, with an obstructive United States in it. Here again, we can hope that the EU-Japan trade agreement, free trade agreement, provides a foundation under which you can trade freely without WTO. But again, this comes at the expense of weakening the multilateral global trading system. I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian. I would ask Ambassador Trepczyński to take the floor for the Polish perspective.
Good morning. At the very beginning, I would like to apologize on behalf of Mr. Porażyński, who was asked by our minister to accompany him in a very important meeting today, and you know you can't refuse your minister. It's why I'm here. I try to do my best to replace him. I will try to, in my introductory statement, to put our discussion in a little broader context. As you are probably very well aware, the European Union has been conducting an open trade policy for many years. If we look at the strategic document adopted in October 2015 by the European Union called the Trade for All, it is clearly mentioned in this document that the way as a world economy works today, global and digital in its core, based on the increasing growth of value-added chains, required a new approach in trade policy. Furthermore, the growing role of trade in services, growing involvement of SMEs in international trade, and interdependence between trade and investments are challenges we must face all in shaping our trade policy. It is why the European Union decided to negotiate and sign a new generation FTAs, free trade agreements, which are covering not only as a traditional FTAs the trade in services, but which are much broader in the scope, covering public procurement, services, special arrangement to SMEs, but also what is more and more important, a provision in regulatory framework. And I think good examples of such new FTAs are agreement with Korea and Japan. If you look at the agreement with Korea, which already is in place for some time, we can see a very positive influence on this agreement on trade of both sides. In our case, for example, the export to Korea doubled since entry into force this agreement. And we strongly believe that such a positive impact we will observe in case of the FTAs with Japan as well. As it was said by Piotr in his introductory statement, the IPA agreement with Japan will cover 30% of the world GDP. And the scope of this agreement is very broad, going far beyond the obligation of both partners under WTO, practically covering all aspects of economic activity. Of course, it's too early to say anything about the real impact of this agreement. But as I said, this is a new generation agreement, and probably together with an agreement, CETA with Canada, may be an example for other similar agreements in the future. The European Union is negotiating several other FTAs at the moment based on this principle I just said. As example, we may, the sounds of Trump are too early, I'm afraid. such an example may be, for example, may be an agreement with Australia, New Zealand, some ASEAN countries. And it's important in our days. Building up a strong network of bilateral agreement is especially essential when we are facing a growing possibility of disintegration of international trade system we all know for many years. Global processes require global solutions. And we in Europe and we in Poland are pretty sure that many substantial problems we face can't be solved on bilateral matter. We need multilateral solutions. But truly speaking, I'm not very optimistic. If we look at the current situation, what we can see now. As Sebastian said, China is not ready to seriously engage in the discussion of strengthening the disciplines in subsidies, state aids, which are, I think, the precondition of building up a new international trade system. At the same time, the US strongly believed that it can solve their problem in bilateral pleasure, not believing in the effective international system. If you look at such countries as India, South Africa, many developing countries, they are really afraid of the discussion about new system, being really worried that this discussion will weaken the development agenda of our multilateral trade discussions. In the context of the organization, which require consensus, it's really not very optimistic. Then what the European Union can do? I think that the priorities for the new future is obvious. The EU must actively promote the multilateral agenda, trying to build alliances as broad as possible, but at the same time to execute the bilateral agenda, to negotiate and conduct a new FTAs, which may be the solution for the future problem, is the system really disintegrate. Of course, the urgent reform of system is needed, as I said. If we will not find a solution for the problem we face with the dispute settlement system or dispute settlement body now, this important tool of the World Trade Organization, of the international trade system, will be paralyzed before the end of this year. It means that instead of the system based on rules, based on principle, we find ourselves in the system of pressure and chaos. I'm not sure that anyone will be a winner when this system really be our everyday practice. I think it's still a possibility to build up a broad, like-minded coalition. The European Union clearly stipulate that dialogue is always better than confrontation. And we are trying to discuss with everyone. We are discussing on the bilateral basis with China, trying somehow to involve them into the current discussion of the WTO reform. We are an active part on the three-party dialogue between the European Union, the US, and Japan to build a new system, proposing a solution for many problems WTO faced. We are the party which pushed strongly for opening the negotiation of e-commerce, and the relevant positive decision was taken in the last conference in Davos. And it's probably a chance to prove that the WTO system is still ready to deliver. It will be a plurilateral agreement, because probably we can't expect any new multilateral agreement to be negotiated soon. But nevertheless, even plurilateral agreement open for every other countries to join in the future is a good solution for current crisis. And at the end, what is important is to keep dialogue with the United States of America. But at the same time, to be prepared for any protectionist measures which may be adopted by the USA. We did it as a Europe in a case of steel aluminum. We are working on a similar arrangement in the sector of vehicles. We know that the investigation is over. We know that the result was passed to the president. President has 3 months to take a decision. And in real terms, it's 3 months of pressure for the European Union. Let's guys behave, because you know we have such an instrument in our hands. But nevertheless, we must stop. We must avoid conflicts with the USA. We must convince the United States of America that if we really would like to solve global problem as hidden subsidies in production, in trade, it's of course the biggest problem for China, but not only for China. If we would like to solve the problem of abusing the role of state-owned enterprise, once again, it's a big problem for China, but not only for China. We can look at the Gazprom or other Russian state-owned enterprises which are used as a political instrument as well. If we would like to solve the problem facing us in the trade of agriculture, the bilateral solution will not be sufficient. We must seek for multilateral arrangements. And I think it's also the role of the European Union to convince our partner, especially now the United States, that their understanding of the problem is correct, and we share their understanding of the problem, that the current system is not working well, that the current system required deep changes, but it doesn't mean that we can seek a solution through the disintegration of the current system. We must try to reform the system together. We must, as like-minded countries, and there are many of them. If you look at the WTO discussion, a lot of countries share our opinion and support the ideas, for example, in DSBU tabled by the European Union. We must build a pressure for those countries which are against the reform. At the same time, we must explain to developing countries that the reform is not against them. The reform is to strengthen the possibility for development. And of course, we can discuss if the current system of developing status based on the self-determination is correct one or not correct one. If we should build up the system when assistance will be directly for LDCs and the countries most in need. But nevertheless, we must explain to developing countries that the disintegration of the system will be very harmful for them. Probably they will be the countries which suffer the most. And only by building up a broad coalition, only by trying to convince developing countries to join those who are trying to reform the system, we can believe in success. Otherwise, as I said, the current system is at stake, and we may face a chaos and unpredictable situation, which is the worst for businesses in every country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Trepczyński. And now we go to slightly different perspective from Japan. Professor Shujiro Urata from Waseda University.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this Europe-Japan dialogue. This is one of my kind of rare occasions to come to Europe, indeed. I spend most of my time traveling Asia Pacific. And so, as I said, this is one of my rare occasions, and I like to learn a lot from the discussions, and I already have learned quite a bit from the previous 2 or 3 speakers. What I'd like to do now is to talk about the importance of Japan-EU or EU-Japan EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, from Japan's side, Japan's perspective, and also from a global perspective, which has been already discussed. But I'd like to maybe add a few points. First, although from the point of view of Europe, or EU, in terms of quantity, like trade, investment, and so on, as I said, as I heard earlier, is not that important. It's not that big. But for Japan, trade is EU, investment relationship is EU, is quite substantial. In terms of trade, if I looked up some of the numbers, about, let's see, 10% of Japan's exports come to Europe, and a little bit less than 10% of Japanese imports come from Europe. So 10% is substantial. And the numbers are even greater in the case of investment. 22% of Japan's investment come to Europe, and as large as 40% of investment to Japan come from Europe. And foreign direct investment plays a very important role in promoting economic growth. And indeed, one of the challenges of the Japanese government, not just this government, but the previous government, is to increase foreign direct investment into Japan. And indeed, I was a chair of a committee which discussed in the cabinet ministry to identify the problems that the foreign companies face in Japan, and then to find out the ways to promote investment into Japan. And if I can just give you a few interesting observations that I learned from this committee's discussion, is that one of the problems that Japan has in attracting foreign direct investment is to attract people. And I'd like to talk about the importance of people's exchange later. In terms of education, foreign workers or employees like to send their children to international schools. But there are very few international schools in Japan, and they're very expensive too. That's one of the obstacles. And another obstacle is to find or get the working permit for spouses of the foreign expatriates workers. So these are people's problems. And in my view, if we can solve these problems associated with people's movement, that will help foreign direct investment and maybe foreign trade to increase. And indeed, Japan has been quite successful in attracting foreign tourists. If you are a frequent visitor to Japan, I think you'll be surprised how many foreign tourists are walking around, roaming around in Tokyo and other places. And this wasn't the case 10 years ago. And indeed, I'm not good at remembering numbers, but I think this year, I think the target for attracting tourists like 30 million or so. It is quite much more than what we had maybe 4 or 5 years ago, which is maybe close to maybe just 10 or 50 million. And again, attracting foreign tourists have led to increase in foreign direct investment already, particularly in the tourism services, building hotels in Tokyo, Hokkaido, and other places by foreign companies is increasing. So this is one of the very, I think, important evidences that attracting foreign people or foreign visitors, not just the short-term visitors, but the long-term visitors for Japan to increase foreign direct investment. Having said this, economic partnership agreement like the one we have with Europe, it's going to contribute to Japan's economic recovery. I'm sure you know a very slow economic growth that Japanese economy has suffering for many years. Since the burst of the bubble in 1990 or 91, Japan's economic growth has been about 1% or around the range. And one of the ways to recover Japan's economy, to regain its competitiveness, of course, is to increase productivity. Japan is a country which is aging. We are seeing the decline, absolute decline in the population already. And for such economy, it is important to maintain the living standard by increasing productivity. Of course, if we can attract many foreign visitors, foreign workers, immigrants, that is another way to increase our economic activity. But the accepting immigrants is a rather difficult challenge for Japan at the moment anyway. So another way to achieve economic growth is to increase productivity. How can we increase productivity? One is, of course, to open up our economy, trade and investment, and also implement domestic reform, like agriculture reform, which is badly needed. And opening up economy and implementing domestic structural reform go hand in hand, so to speak, can be done jointly. And that's what we need. And EPA, like the one we have in Europe, is one possible a way to increase or to open up Japanese economy and to implement structural reform. And with that objective, Japanese government, I agree with the Japanese government approach toward free trade agreements or economic partnership agreements. And one with Europe is very important, and as been discussed earlier, Japan was successful in concluding TPP-11, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, including 11 countries, or excluding the United States, successfully. And Japan played a very important role in achieving a successful negotiation. And very often I've been asked why Japan was successful in getting the TPP-11 concluded. And in my view, this is Prime Minister Abe who spent so much political capital in TPP-12, that is original TPP. Original TPP was considered as one of the important elements of Abenomics, Abe economics, which is the policy that he introduced when he came into the office in 2012. And this Abenomics had three important arrows or elements, so-called monetary policy, fiscal policy, and growth strategy. And TPP was one of the most important components of growth strategy. But because of the US, because of Mr. Trump, that the TPP-12 came to an end. And Japan, along with a country like Australia, get together and then move forward and successfully to achieve conclusion. And earlier I heard that the Japan EU EPA didn't take that long. Let's see, 2013 to so practically 4 or 5 years, right? That may be short, but I guess what could be the reasons? I think that this so-called competitive regionalism, TPP began negotiation in 2010, right? Japan joined TPP negotiations in 2013, and 2013 is a very important year for this regionalism. 2013 is the year that Japan-EU EPA negotiation began, and also RCEP, which is a regional comprehensive economic partnership involving 16 East Asian countries. That negotiation began in 2013. TTIP negotiation, which kind of disappeared, so to speak, maybe, began in 2013. Japan-Korea FTA negotiations began in 2013. So everything, or many mega FTAs, so-called, began negotiation in 2013. And one hypothesis behind this kind of, many mega FTAs began to negotiate the same year is this: Japan joined TPP negotiations after a couple of years of kind of debates between Japan and the US. And so some countries, like China, thought that we have to do something. We cannot just let TPP go forward. And China and Japan jointly decided to kind of put forward this RCEP negotiation, something like that. So again, competitive regionalism was one of the reasons, I think, which led to speedy conclusion of Japan-EU EPA and also other EPAs. I mean, having said this, TPP-11, which excludes the United States, was put into force December 30th last year. And the challenge that these 11 countries are faced with at the moment is to increase the number of participants. Some countries showed interest in joining TPP-11. Formally, it's called Comprehensive Progressive TPP, CPTPP. So there are so many of these CPTPP, TPP-11. But anyway, and I guess I understand the UK is one of the countries which showed interest in joining CPTPP, and I think they're welcome. But now TPP-11 countries have to finalize the chapter on accession. They haven't done that. That will take some time, I'm sure. But again, it is important for TPP-11 countries to broaden partnership. And indeed, I'd like to see EU to come on board with TPP-11 and eventually RCEP, maybe. I said maybe because I know RCEP negotiations are faced with many difficult challenges. One of the issues is the China-India trade agreement. Of course, India they have this Make in India project by Prime Minister Modi. So they are interested in developing manufacturing sector. But at the moment, Indian manufactured product market is kind of dominated by Chinese products already. So they cannot really open up their market toward Chinese products even more. And indeed, before coming here to Warsaw, I was in Bali, Indonesia, to participate in discussions there. But there, at the same hotel that I stayed in, RCEP negotiations were going on. And I talked to some of the officials that I knew from my previous experiences, told me about some progress, but they still have some difficult problems. But they do hope that they can conclude by the end of this year. That's what they said. But that's what's been saying for a couple of years. But again, RCEP negotiation is now at the very important juncture in the negotiations. Let's see. And the importance of Japan-EU EPA has been discussed already, and I do agree that this is very important for these two countries or regions which share same fundamental value, important values such as democracy, rules of law, rule of law, human rights, freedom of speech, and so on, free trade. And Japan-EU can contribute to, or Japan-EU economic partnership in particular, can contribute to fight against the rising protectionism. And power-based system which Mr. Trump is trying to pursue may give benefits to the US, but that is, I think, very myopic, very short-sighted. US, after all, has a relationship with other countries. If this power-based system leads to decline or the problems in US trading partners like EU, like Japan, other countries, US will get hurt as well. So, and we all know the experiences of interwar period because of trade war, which led to decline in economic activities, eventually, which led to the World War II. And we don't want to see that happen. And I think like economists like myself, academics, maybe researchers have to keep on telling the general public the serious consequences of this kind of trade war situation. And we need let the politicians realize the possible consequences of this kind of policy. And then it is easy for me to say it is important to pursue trade liberalization for all the countries in the world, including Japan. But as being said earlier, countries need to deal with some possible negative impacts or adjustment problems. In the case of Japan, agriculture is a sector which has been protected for many years and which opposes to the idea of free trade agreements. And good reason is there because of political reasons. Politicians need support from agriculture farmers to get re-elected, and that is true. But we need to deal with these negative consequences by providing social safety net. We cannot provide social safety net forever. Or social safety net has to be temporary, not a permanent, but that has to be given. And we don't have that system in Japan. We have a system to provide subsidies before things happen. In other words, what we need is to deal with the negative impacts which, say, farmers have to face after trade liberalization. But in Japan, we try to avoid trade liberalization. by saying that the farmers will be hurt. That's true. But we really have to understand, in order to achieve economic growth, you have to shift the resources from non-productive sectors to productive sectors, and particularly the case for a country like Japan, which is experiencing declining population. So population, labor is very scarce, very important. We cannot waste labor, workers engaged in unproductive, non-productive activities. So we have to shift or move resources from non-productive sector to productive sector. And protectionism stops that kind of mechanism, and that is very important. And again, I've been kind of trying to persuade politicians to understand the mechanism or the theory behind this, and they say they do understand it. But when it comes to elections, they just have to, they just forget about these important messages. Okay, now let me just, I'd like to say a few words about China. It is true that China may not be maybe violating international laws, as they say, because there's no legal framework to discuss the forced technology transfer and so on. And also, for Japan, Japan and other East Asian countries did apply some of the policies which China is now applying, but the 30 years ago it was okay, but now it is not okay. That's what the international framework is all about. So I have some sympathy, I mean not very much, but some sympathy with Chinese when they say, why can't we do this? Why can't we catch up with the advanced country by using subsidy? Because it is not allowed now. It was 30 or 40 years ago when Japan was growing. So in that sense, I have some sympathy. But the problem with China is not, in my view, not economic. In terms of economic growth, I like to see China grow economically. That will benefit eventually all the countries in the world. But to me, what is the problem is China is not economic. They are aggressive, international relations policy, and that really worries me. So we cannot really separate these two issues, economic and non-economic issues. But if we can see China grow economically, peacefully, that'll be okay. That's fine with me. But the second part, grow peacefully, is the challenge that we have to really deal with. And with that, I'd like to end my first intervention. I have a few more maybe things I want to say about the world trading system and so on, but let me just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Urata. I would spare the audience of the first question problem because we have additional fourth presentation. We have a co-author of the mentioned already study of Bruegel about the EU-Japan agreement. Sonali Chaudhary will now take the floor for a couple of minutes.
Thank you. So essentially I'll be presenting the main conclusions of a study that I co-authored with Bruegel for the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament. This study was published in September of last year, and the main objective was essentially to inform members of European Parliament as well as public discourse on the features of this agreement ahead of its ratification. So we essentially delve into two main questions in the study, the first being to analyze the impact of the agreement on a number of dimensions, be it GDP, trade flows, investment, wages, or the environment, though I will restrict how much in depth I go today. And also we provide a comprehensive comparison of this provisions of this agreement with other third generation or new generation free trade agreements of the EU. So before I dive into the provisions, I would like to kind of summarize what the current trade and investment relationship is between EU and Japan. So the top graph shows EU's trade relationship with Japan over the past few years, and we see the orange bars indicating a small amount of trade surplus that EU has with respect to Japan that reached about 6.5 billion euros in 2017. And this trade surplus that EU has with Japan is largely driven by EU services exports to Japan. If we look at the composition of this trade flows, on both the imports as well as the export side, trade in goods actually dominates EU-Japan trade. And these goods trades are, on the import side, EU tends to purchase machinery and transport equipment from Japan, and even on the export side, EU exports chemicals, machinery, and transportation. And this is an interesting aspect of EU-Japan relations, that much of it is actually within industry trade as opposed to trade across industries, and will also have a consequence, a bearing for what the impact of the agreement will be. So while services trade is dominated by goods trade, it nonetheless is driving the overall surplus that EU has with Japan. So this chart shows, the blue line shows EU's exports, services exports to Japan rising over the years relative to the imports. And in 2017, about 32 billion euros of services were exported to Japan from the EU. And these are predominantly financial services and telecommunications. On the investment side, so the first chart is showing the blue bars are EU's outward investment into Japan, and we see that they're quite stable over time and growing at about maybe 0.5% per annum, but Japanese investment into the EU is much higher and is also increasing over time. So it increased from about 150 billion euros in 2013 to a little more than 200 billion euros in 2016. And this also points to the arguments made earlier in the panel about how Japan has followed a very investment-led trade strategy and has long-term interests in the EU markets. The second graph is showing the kind of total portfolio of EU investments in the world. And we see that this distribution is really skewed. So about 36% of EU's FDI is going to the US, and only about 1.1% is going to Japan. So currently, EU-Japan trade and investment is not as vibrant as one might expect given their economic sizes. And I think this is also one of the key reasons why this agreement was considered valuable, to try and kind of fulfill this untapped potential. So, to the larger question of what is the economic rationale for negotiating such an agreement, first, of course, is to promote and diversify EU as well as Japan's portfolio of trade and investment. And a source of bilateral concern was that Japan's share of EU's goods trade was actually declining relatively over time. So if you look at share of Japan in EU's goods exports, they dropped from 6.9% in 1990 to 3.2% in 2017. And share of Japan in EU's imports have reduced even more, from 12% in 1990 to 3.7% in 2017. So this kind of was a bilateral concern in the negotiations, and the EU-Japan agreement is kind of a response to this trend. As was mentioned earlier, the Trade for All strategy that was launched in 2015 also envisioned deeper integration of EU firms and consumers into fast-growing Asian markets, and the EU-Japan agreement is one kind of pillar in that strategy. And last but not the least, even though the economic impact of this agreement might be not globally systemic, that's a question up for debate, but it definitely has an insurance function against economic and regulatory uncertainty. So going by one of the recent policy measures, there's the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, which is published by Stanford economist Nicholas Bloom and others. And according to that metric, uncertainty today is as high as it was during the financial crisis on the back of trade disputes as well as tight credit market conditions. So definitely, the EU-Japan agreement can provide a source of stability as well as a channel for growth in this time of turbulence. The next issue that we dealt with in our study was to compare the content of the EU-Japan agreement with 3 other recent trade agreements of the EU. For this, we studied the CETA agreement, the EU-Singapore, as well as the EU-Korea trade agreements.
And the methodology we followed was one that's well recognized and proposed by Horn, Mavradi, and Sapir, where we classified provisions into WTO Plus and WTO Extra, and then studied the coverage, coverage of issues, as well as the legal enforceability of the language of these provisions. And this table is kind of an example table for our classification in WTO Plus areas for all these agreements. So the main observations were that in WTO Plus areas, such as GATS or TRIPS and state aid, the EU-Japan agreement is quite similar to these other 3 new generation FTAs of the EU in terms of coverage of issues and legal enforceability of language. The differences actually start emerging when we look at the WTO extra areas like competition policy or sustainable development. And here, the EU-Japan agreement is similar but not identical to other new generation FTAs of the EU, primarily because it's introducing new provisions such as a dedicated chapter on corporate governance and SMEs, as well as a commitment to the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But the overall conclusion is that the EU-Japan agreement kind of belongs to this family of new generation FTAs, but it is still one step forward in that it represents some institutional innovations and can serve as kind of a benchmark for future trade agreements that will be negotiated by EU and Japan with other trade partners. On the projected economic impact, what we did was an exhaustive meta-analysis of existing studies on EU-Japan. These studies try and get to a causal impact by using something known as a CGE, or a computational general equilibrium model, and also new quantitative trade theory models in economics. This chart shows the projected impact of the agreement on EU's GDP across studies that were published since 2009. And one thing that's quite striking and immediately clear is the level of variation across studies and their expectations of the impact. And we see this is actually driven to a large extent because of differences in model assumptions. So different studies have different baseline scenarios and liberalization scenarios that result in different outcomes. So for example, in the earlier studies where we see almost a negative or a minimal impact, in those studies it was assumed that there would be no non-tariff barrier reductions in EU-Japan under this agreement, whereas in these first four bars that are showing studies published after the negotiations were finalized, we see that the impact is definitely not negative, it's positive, because tariff elimination is also coupled with significant NTB reduction in the agreement. So there's definitely convergence in the expected results of the agreement in the later years, with the DG trade assessment expecting a 0.14% increase in EU's GDP. But it's understandable that we might be concerned how the results might be driven by model definitions or model assumptions. That's why it's important to look at the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement as kind of providing a proxy for what might happen under the EU-Japan agreement. Now, what is the rationale for looking at the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement as kind of a guideline? And there are two main reasons. One is that the kind of goods that EU imports from Japan are actually quite similar from the type of goods it imports from Korea. So there is a similarity in trade baskets. And second, the coverage of issues in EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement was broadly similar to that of EU-Japan. So these two kind of findings help us use the EU-Korea FTA, the causal impact of the EU-Korea FTA, as providing a kind of lower bound on what might happen under the EU-Japan agreement. And here we see that the GDP increased for EU by 0.1%. One common limitation that I would like to point out for these studies is that often they do not have any dynamic component. So welfare gains that come from firms innovating more in response to increased import competition, these are not typically modeled in these studies. Moreover, FDI flows are also not typically analyzed. So it could be that we're actually underestimating the impact of the FTA over the long run, where FDI flows and dynamic welfare gains are actually more prominent. Given that we've talked about the magnitude of these gains, it's equally important to understand what are the mechanisms that generate these gains in the first place. And our study finds that welfare gains are predominantly driven by reductions in NTBs, and those are key for these growth numbers that I've just talked about. And this kind of makes sense because Japan is relatively a low tariff economy anyway. So if you look at industrial goods, the simple average of its applied MFN is about 2.5%. So therefore, NTB reduction in perhaps simplifying procedures or mutual recognition of standards is really important for these welfare gains. Continuing on the impact on the trade side, most studies predict a very robust increase on bilateral trade. The DG Trade assessment shows an increase of 13 billion euros in EU exports and a 22 billion euro increase in EU imports. If you look across sectors, no EU sector is expected to experience noticeable losses according to DG Trade, and there are substantial gains for the agri-food sector, of course, given that Japan has agreed to protect geographical indications as well as provide tariff elimination on a number of key products such as duty-free entry of wine or phase out of tariffs on processed agricultural products. But this is not just a cars for cheese agreement as was dubbed in newspapers, because we do see a very positive impact on manufacturing sectors such as on textiles, apparel, and leather, where EU exports are expected to increase by 220% to Japan. On the sectoral impact question, one thing that we kept encountering while we were conducting our study is the concern of the automobile sector from increased import competition, given that EU is slated to phase out its tariffs on passenger vehicles and car components over 7 years. So here we see that the impact of the automobile sector is again quite model dependent. It kind of hinges on the degree of non-tariff barrier reduction. If Japan is able to reduce non-tariff barriers, for example, by adopting UNICE standards for vehicle safety, we see that EU is able to export more cars to Japan following the agreement. And this kind of offsets the increase in import competition from Japanese cars within the domestic market. And so this kind of explains the DG Trade assessment of only a very minor contraction on automobiles following the agreement. Even from expert interviews, the consensus emerges that the risks of contraction are quite limited. According to those experts, both on the EU as well as the Japanese side, the reason for that was that not only are Japanese companies already producing within the EU, but also European manufacturers are using Japanese technical components in their manufacturing, and these are expected to become cheaper following the agreement. Again, on the distributional aspect, the labor market is expected to only experience modest shifts, and real wages are expected to increase on both sides of the scale spectrum. Coming to further issues, quickly to summarize, we know that investor-state dispute settlement negotiations are still ongoing, and swift progress on these talks will not be easy, but it will be very important for realizing the full potential of the agreement. There's also a concern that EU producers might not fully utilize the tariff rate quotas that are provided under the agreement, so the implementation has to make sure that there's enough information as well as technical capacity for firms to take advantage of these preferences. And one big Brexit elephant in the room needs to be discussed further as well, according to our study, and since UK is a very important market for Japan, but also a very important source of investment. Finally, there are important headwinds facing both Japan and EU on the question of global growth and global economic growth as well as trade. So if we go back to recent indicators, both the WTO quarterly trade outlook has hit a 9-year low, and the IMF has also revised its global growth forecast from 3.7 to 3.5% for this year. So this kind of re-emphasizes the need for the EU-Japan agreement to act as kind of a stability, a source of stability in this economic scenario. In conclusion, we consider the EU-Japan agreement to be a relatively well-crafted agreement that will boost the economic presence of EU as well as its political relevance in Asia-Pacific. Of course, the geopolitical dimension, as has been discussed before, is extremely important because it envisions the kind of rules-based and cooperative international order. And finally, on the issue of systemic importance of this agreement, while the market size is very large under this agreement, it could be systemically important also because it could inform the future trade relationships that EU and Japan have with other major economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonali. We will go a little bit into the break time, so we still have some like 12 to 15 minutes for the discussion or comments. So if anybody would like to have a comment, yes, please.
Well, I'd like to thank ECFR for organizing this conference, focusing on Japan-EU relations, inviting guests from Japan. My thanks also goes to Professor Urata and Professor Jinguji, who have come far from Japan. Given the present international conjuncture, I think it is really time for Japan and the EU to cooperate, to work together, to preserve free trade system, to preserve open, free society. And as Professor Urata pointed out, I think it is important for the academic sector to give warning to protectionism and anti-multilateralism. And in that sense, I do appreciate the ECFR initiative to hold this seminar at this very good timing. I have some observations about the impact of EPA. There are some comments that the economic impact is quite minor in terms of trade volume and other economic volumes. But from my point of view, as ambassador here in Poland, I feel that the impact would be larger than the figures show. Actually, there are about 300 Japanese companies who have invested here in Poland. And they are quite optimistic about the future. They are expecting the improvement of their activities after the conclusion, after the entering into force of FTA. And there are more Japanese companies who are enthusiastic about investing here in Poland, taking advantage of this occasion. I think this agreement have much more impact, what should I say, not what should I say, emotional, not emotional. It is not good. That has a much more substantial impact on the conduct of every individual economic players. If you look at the total figures, probably the figure is not so large, but I think in the long term, it has a certain substantial impact on the conduct of individual companies, individual players. So it does certainly have a political impact, but not only political impact, but also economic in terms, it has a very substantial impact in the long term. It is my observation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Anybody else?
My name is Maaike Okene-Heijmans. I'm from the Klingendael Institute in The Hague, and I really enjoyed the 4 presentations. My question is about next steps, basically. Yes, the EU-Japan, I think it's very important. It's great that it has been agreed, signed, and now we're moving towards implementation. And that's something we have to work very hard on, because that's it's only then that we get to really benefit from this. But I also would like to push the speakers a little bit to think about next steps. So how are we going to leverage this EPA? And indeed, the systemic change that you were pointing to, is that really for EU-Japan in their bilaterals with other countries, or mega FTAs, or regionals to pursue, or is it going to have wider effects? I would like to hear a bit more of your thoughts on this, because to me it looks like the key challenge that we are facing today is one, we need to update the rule book. And the EU-Japan EPA is contributing to that. I think, especially from our last presentation, it was clear. You know how new chapters have been included: SMEs, climate change, corporate governance, very important. But what else can we do? And what are the next steps? So updating the rule book, and how to discipline basically state capitalism in this rules-based order that we have now. China, Professor Urata of course mentioned, is indeed the big challenge in this regard. And yes, we should have some sympathy because we all developed with more state help than what we find acceptable today. But obviously what we see now coming from China is to a large extent not acceptable, or at least not to our best interest. So that's a reason to discuss this. So in my own thinking, in my work, I follow different tracks. And I would like to link here to what the speakers have said, to push them a little further and hope for hopefully further suggestions. The plurilaterals, of course, is one, as Ambassador mentioned. E-commerce is one field. How do you see that? Do you really see that happening? We know, of course, the challenges with that. And is there other fields? Data protection is, of course, also coming through the EU-Japan EPA. What can we expect from this? Reform of the WTO. How are the EU and Japan indeed cooperating with and pushing against the US unilateral push? And what chances of success? What can we do better, both separate and together? Same goes for engaging and resisting China. And it's very different approach to capitalism. And to the European speakers, the question would be, how do we get our own house in order? Because as much as we may be complaining about others, where we can really make a difference is by improving our own tools and instruments. And I feel that we have a long way to go there as well. Investment monitoring, of course, is one that's on the agenda now. We are moving also to government procurement rules. What is on your mind in this regard? So can we make, to refer back to what Professor Urata said, as 2013 as a sort of a breakthrough year, can we make 2019 also a breakthrough year? Perhaps not in bilaterals, but if done on plurilaterals and perhaps sector-specific developments or breakthroughs in this system. Thank you.
Maybe last remark from the audience, and then I would ask all three panelists to somehow sum up.
Thank you, Chair. Slavomir Majman, Warsaw Exhibition Board, Zhemin University of Beijing. Let me very briefly mix Japanese optimism with a typical Polish pessimism. The optimism, as far as optimism is concerned, let me echo Mr. Ambassador. According to the survey made by Shokokai, the Association of Japanese Companies in Poland, they are not afraid of a future connected with the escalation of conflicts, global conflicts on trade, and they consider European Union and Poland as a right place to develop their businesses. It's over 100 Japanese companies united in Shokokai. I think it's a good piece of news. Then let me add just a little bit of a little touch of horror. A trade and the dispute of a future of international trade is definitely number one strategic and political issue as well in the current dispute about global governance. We know the American position of Donald Trump. We know that for United States at the moment, the trade issue, first of all, trade issues connected with China are absolutely point number one on the political agenda and strategic agenda. That's why many experts on geopolitics predict that this trade competition between these two countries will sooner or later could lead to global conflict. And I think we should take such opportunity quite seriously. On the other hand, we have our Chinese friends, who are parading sort of adherence to the principles of free trade and multilateralism, at the same time pursuing the policy of Pax Sinica, especially in Asia. And then finally we have a WTO, where Ambassador Trepczyński was talking a lot about, but WTO seems to be a little bit helpless in dispute settlement. And both rivals, America and China, didn't pay a dime what the WTO is doing, introducing various sanctions. Americans are actually even not consulting WTO. And then we have our countries in Europe, European Union members, put into a little bit awkward position. First of all, Poland is the #1 ally of the United States, and we got a Japan. At the beginning of the Cold War, John Foster Dulles said that neutrality is immoral. At this stage of a conflict for global governance system, multilateral, bilateral, I suppose countries like Japan and European Union member countries should understand as well that it could be very difficult to work on neutrality, to carry on with neutrality. Especially Poland is encountering quite a lot of pains at the moment with formulating its position versus the changes in international trade and relations with China, America. That's why, again, my question comes to the nearest future. How do you predict the future of such institutions like WTO? And how do you predict the reasonable approach of countries like Japan and Poland in the condition of the global and escalating conflict, sooner or later escalating conflict between China and the United States? Thank you.
Thank you. So now I would ask all three panelists for a quick concluding remarks.
Thanks for all the very interesting questions and comments. I would like to pick up just what Mike has said and link that a little bit to what has been said in this room as well. I think we need to keep in mind that all these FTAs, mega FTAs, regional blocks, they are only second best to WTO solutions. And this is particularly true for developing countries. If you have a free trade agreement, or if you have 10 free trade agreements, you have 10 different sets of rules, you have rules of origin, you have different documentations, and so on. And what we have seen and what we experience is that especially in less developed countries, the companies do not have the capabilities to use all this. And in fact, not only in less developed countries, when the EU-Korea FTA came into effect, we saw that utilization rates initially, especially for SMEs in Korea, they were not very high. So they were still exporting under WTO rules, even to Europe, despite they could have had preferential access. And I think this is a fundamental issue. So what does that mean? Well, if we have a shift from a more multilateral approach to more and more of these FTAs, and I mean we have been seeing this shift, that means that the world trading environment gets more difficult for developing countries, and especially developing countries get less out of that as the more advanced economies. And this is a problem, especially if you want to sustain support by all countries for free trade. So in this, in the end, despite the success of passing the EU-Japan FTA now, or EPA now, I would like to call upon the parties, especially also EU and Japan, to also put emphasis on preserving and pushing forward the multilateral order. I'm completely aware that is extremely difficult at the moment with the US, and I don't see a way around. If the WTO is constructed in a way that if the US wants to obstruct reform and anything, they have a lot of ways to do that. So in this way, this is a bit of a downward beat or mood at the end, but I think we still should focus on multilateral solutions.
Thank you, Sebastian. Ambassador Trepczyński.
Yes, thank you very much. A lot of different questions and a lot of different thoughts. Maybe I'll concentrate only on some issues. First, the situation of Poland. If we look at the figures, they are very convincing. In case of Poland, share of export to GDP in our case is over 50%. Foreign trade is an important element of development in my country. At the same time, if we look at the US, it's only 12%. Then we can see where the real interest in reforming and keeping the system alive is. And especially under the circumstances when we don't really know what are the real position of the main, let's say, opponent of the system at this time, the United States of America. Please, if anyone can, in a convincing way, explain what the US really wants, how they see the WTO working, how they see the international trade system be shaped, except the very beautiful phrase, America first. Practically, we don't see any, we only heard critics. We can face in the WTO. The US are not happy with the dispute settlement body, which, by the way, is not so ineffective. Under this system, Costa Rica won a case against the United States, and the United States was obliged to change their regulation in textiles, in rules of origin. Without the system, how the small Costa Rica ever may oppose the US? I doubt no chance for them. Then the system is a real asset. Of course, it's not working perfect. The cases are far beyond the existing timelines for the investigation, but the cases become more and more complicated. A few years ago, a normal DSBU case won 1 box of paper. Now in 3-5 meters of papers, you know. Then probably before taking any far-reaching agreement, we firstly should look at the reason why the system is not working as we envisaged it in 1993. A lot of time passed. The system is much more complicated. Then we are facing the situation when the US is criticizing the system, but till now has not submitted any concrete proposal from their side. Then this is the problem. The US, President Trump in August 2018 said that the US will withdraw from the WTO if the system would not reform. But once again, how it should be reformed? Of course, we must strengthen the discipline, and we are working with this. We have a very good cooperation with Japan in this regard. We are strongly working with Japan in this three-party group together with the US, and we submitted already some proposal concerning the strengthening of the notification system, the transparency, and so on. Then we must try to support the discussion and to strengthen the multilateral system, but future is not clear till now. You ask what the other solution except what I said. There are different ideas. For example, an agreement on investment. Multilateral, plurilateral agreement on investment we should work out. Discussion started in G20. There are some not binding recommendations, but truly if we look at the international economy, there are still rules on trade. There is not multilateral rules on investment. There are discussions in the WTO because probably it's the only organization relevant for such a discussion and to work up an agreement on investment. Then there are different possibilities to promote multilateral agenda, and we should use it. Otherwise, as I said, we can face a difficult period of chaos, but truly speaking, I don't believe in a global trade war, as somebody said here. Even if you look at the investigation in cars under the US regulation, it was public, it is still in the internet, hearings. Mostly, except probably trade unions, more or other players were against the introduction of additional duties. Almost all players which took part in this hearing underline that there will be also a strong negative effect on the US economy in this case. Then probably global war not, probably bilateral pressure, strong bilateral pressure. We saw it that it was somehow gave a positive impact for the US in case of, for example, of Canada and Mexico. But I don't believe in global war as such at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador and Professor Urata.
Thank you very much for many comments or maybe questions. I'd like to talk about next steps. One, I guess, use of FTA. So we need to evaluate the impacts of FTA in order to move forward. I mean, this is somewhat different, maybe, implementation that you were talking about. As for myself, I've been working on the estimating or measuring the use of FTA for Japanese FTAs. And as was said earlier, for export, they have to, of course, comply by these rules of origin, and for the companies, especially SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, it's not easy for them to satisfy these requirements. So again, there are some room for maybe improvement in terms of use of FTA, and that kind of issues will be brought up or will be exposed by doing research or academic research, and which I've been working myself. So in order to move forward, we have to evaluate the impacts of FTAs. I know it's not easy. As Ambassador said, it's not easy to maybe quantify the impacts, but maybe you can ask companies whether their company strategies are affected by FTAs. And I guess some comments came from Ambassador was yes for some companies. So we'd like to know how FTAs have affected real economy. And next point is the WTO. I'm not a specialist in WTO, but WTO, if I understand correctly, is like hard law as opposed to soft law kind of framework. Maybe in order to introduce new elements like digital economy, EU has its own digital kind of framework, US and China. So it's not easy to come to one common framework which satisfies or which suits to all the three different frameworks. So possible kind of idea is to deal with the new area is to have something like a soft law in the sense like guidelines, I mean, to begin with, and then maybe they can move forward. And in this respect, I think APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, is an interesting framework because it's non-binding, voluntary. If you remember correctly, this digital, I mean, what is this? This agreement on electronics and technology agreement. I think this idea came from APEC, if I'm not mistaken. And so this kind of new, in order to deal with new area, you can begin discussing the issues in a kind of soft law or non-binding framework, and which may be later become part of a maybe hard law. So I think APEC kind of approach will be very interesting. Sorry, it's ITA, Information Technology Agreement. I just escaped my mind. And environmental goods agreement also, if I understand correctly, partly maybe came from an idea from APEC. So in order to deal with new areas such as digital economy, you may think of possible discussion in APEC to begin with. And finally, just on China, in order to deal with maybe even United States, which we do not agree. We have to find a group of people inside that country which have a sympathy with our idea. In other words, I like to see multinational corporations or farmers in the United States who disagree with Mr. Trump, and of course who agree with us. Then we can mobilize, their groups, and then eventually, hopefully, that put pressure on Mr. Trump to change policy. And same can be said about maybe China. It takes some time for us to get some, ties up with the groups in China who agree with us in terms of like IPR, intellectual property right. And I understand there's some interesting movement in China. Now, Chinese corporations are complaining about the theft, IPR theft by other Chinese companies. And so they realize the importance of IPR protection. And although it takes time, maybe that's the kind of thing that we need to really wait and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you all for the participation in the first panel.